is Andrew Unger, author of The Daily Bonnet and the new novel Once Removed. I'm also a high school English teacher. I've taught ELA for about 15 years or so. I figured I'd share my thoughts on how I would use Once Removed if I was going to teach it in a class. And I'm not intending in this video to give unit plans and detailed lesson plans and stuff like that. I'm assuming that if you're a teacher, you can come up with the units and lessons and how you want to teach it, but I'm just kind of presenting some general ideas. The book is geared towards an adult audience or a general audience. It's not a young adult fiction, but I think it could be used in high school and post-secondary classes. The basic story is about Timothy Hepner, who lives in a small Manitoba town, and he works as a ghostwriter, recording the stories, life stories of the older folks in town. But he also works during the day. It's the only job he could find. He works for the town's Parks and Rec department, demolishing historic buildings because the mayor is very aggressive and wants to make room for a mega mart or a big box store or something. So I think it's a sort of story that a lot of people that live in rural areas can relate to, but also in big cities, because there's a lot of discussion about preservation of historic sites and demolition of buildings. The book raises a lot of questions about what progress is and isn't, what matters in a community. So if you're interested in exploring those things and want to laugh while you're at it, check it out and see if it might be useful in your classroom. Most of my comments apply to teaching in an ELA classroom, but I do think Once Removed could be used in a social studies or history class, especially because it deals a lot with preservation and history, how people do or don't preserve the historic buildings, and what are the motivations behind that. I know a lot of people talk about modeling for students, like you need to show them your own writing, for example, and show them that you struggle, and show them multiple drafts that you do, and show them that process, that thinking process, that it doesn't just come automatic. But I think another thing that is really important for new writers, young writers, students in high school and just out of high school, is the idea that their voices and their stories matter. Sometimes, if you live in a small town, or even if you live in a city, say, the size of Winnipeg, you don't really see your own stories being depicted. They're watching Hollywood movies, they're watching YouTube videos, etc., and they don't see Winnipeg depicted very often, or Swift Current, or even, I think, even large Canadian cities like Toronto or Vancouver, movies are filmed there, but very rarely is that the setting of the movie. I think this even applies even if you live in other countries. If you don't live in one of the big two cities in a particular country, like say if you live in Omaha, Nebraska, how often is Omaha in movies or popular culture that people consume? Quite rarely. And so people get the impression, I think, young people get the impression that their stories aren't valid, their stories don't matter, because they never see those stories being put out there. Everything is just set in Los Angeles or New York. And you might get the impression that unless your story is set in one of those places, that it doesn't have value. That's why I think it's really important to introduce students to local writers. Seek out and find who those stories are. And not just local writers, but stories set in those places. So that students can see it and they can go, you know what? I can literally write about my small town. And maybe I think nothing happens there. Okay, if you think that nothing happens in your town, then create a character who thinks my town is terrible and nothing happens and it's really boring. And create that voice and see where the story goes from there. But I think that students need to feel free to be able to write from the place that they are at and from their own experiences, rather than trying to imagine what it's like to live in some other place, or imagine what the life is like of some other person that's not their own experiences. So introducing students to local literature really helps with that. And you can also show, look, so for example, where I live in Steinbach, you can say, hey, look, you know what? This writer, it was very important, one of the most famous Canadian writers, and she came from this small town and even writes about it. Once they've done that and seen it modeled, then you can encourage them to actually write. A lot of times when young writers are taught how to write, they're taught to use your imagination. And of course, that's a very important aspect of writing. But I think that writing is just as much about observation as an imagination. You know, a writer is an observer, and other artists too, you know, not that you're sitting in a hallway somewhere, you know, taking notes necessarily, although you might. Just observing details and retaining them, or maybe writing them down, and then using those at some point in your fiction. Ultimately, writing fiction and creative writing is an act of imagination. It is a creative endeavor, even if you're using real details. The way you put it all together is an act of creation of the author. And they can start from literally what they did that day and go and build the story from there. I think that's less intimidating than if they think they have to create an entire universe that's completely fictional, completely made up. I mean, even if you're talking about fantasy or sci-fi writing, there's a basis of observation, not just imagination. I think, you know, using the local writing and then transitioning to a creative writing unit where students are encouraged to hone their powers of observation and use them in creative writing, I think is a really interesting idea that you could explore. Another idea I wanted to leave you with was doing a unit on comedy, or even specifically satire if you want. I think that a lot of times comedy is considered lesser, you know, maybe we as teachers or just people in general like to take ourselves very seriously. Comedy and laughter is a very important aspect of communication. It's not just about laughing and making jokes, but it's how we connect to other people. Think about the positive relationships that are developed and maintained through humor. So if you're teaching communication, you should be teaching comedy as part of it. There's a lot of interesting questions you can discuss about comedy. Why do some people find one thing funny and another person finds it offensive? How does a joke work? Stand-up comedy is a really interesting art form to explore. A while ago, there's a local stand-up comedian here, Matt Falk, who's quite a popular local stand-up comedian. And I remember him saying in a lecture he gave once that he would have loved it if in high school his English teacher had given him the opportunity to do a stand-up comedy routine for the class as an assignment. You know, it may be very rare that you have a student that wants to get up in front of class and do a stand-up comedy routine. But you could definitely work on writing stand-up comedy. I'm not a stand-up comedian myself, but I studied the structure. And you could look at the structure of, and if you Google it, stand-up comedy, joke structure, right? You have the premise, the setup, the punchline, the tags, and the callback. If you want to teach structure and organization of ideas, teaching stand-up comedy, even just writing it, even maybe not performance is a whole nother thing, right? But even just writing stand-up comedy is well worth it because you really have to be organized. When you watch stand-up comedy, it looks like they're just naturally funny. They probably are naturally funny, but it looks like they just spew it out there and they're just going off the cuff. A good stand-up comedian will make you think that they're going off the cuff, but really they've worked on it and honed it and practiced it. I was discussing this a little bit with Matt Falk and comparing what he does with stand-up comedy to what I do with the Daily Bonnet, which is a satire website, so they're satirical articles. And the thing that he said was, you know, when he's doing stand-up comedy, you can tell a joke, and if it doesn't go over well, then you tell it the next day and tweak it a little bit, and you can kind of work it so that at the point when you've told that joke a number of times, it's really good, and you just have the funny bits, and you just have the parts where people are going to laugh, or you ditch it completely. With something like the Daily Bonnet, I don't really have that luxury. You put an article out there, you can't write the next day a slightly modified article of the same, you know, with the same idea, the same premise. So there's a different art form there in writing stand-up comedy than writing satire. In my novel, Once Removed, I would not classify it as satire. It contains elements of satire. That's actually another thing that you could do in class is you could look at a piece of comedy, something a little bit lengthier, like a novel or a movie, and you could pick out all the different types of comedy that are in it. Satire, parody, deadpan humor, dry humor, slapstick, that sort of thing. It's really interesting how you can talk about even just the differences between slapstick and satire or parody, right? Because slapstick is immediately funny. It doesn't require any explanation. It doesn't require any knowledge. And it's cross-cultural and cross-age. Little kid could laugh at a Charlie Chaplin movie or Buster Keaton movie, someone getting hurt, right? Whereas something like satire requires a knowledge of who is being satirized and the point that's being made. If you're interested specifically in more information about comedy and satire, I have some links on my website, andrewanger.com, where it says teaching satire, and you can find a whole bunch of things on comedy and specifically on teaching satire. If you do read my book and you decide you want to use it in your classroom or try it out, by all means send me an email. Unless I get overwhelmed with requests, I'll reply and interact and share my thoughts on whatever you are interested in doing. Alright, so I hope you found that helpful, and by all means contact me if you're interested in learning more about my book or any of the comments I had about teaching ELA and comedy and local writing and all that kind of stuff. So let me know. Thanks.